Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Welcome back to another episode of Wild Turkey Science Podcast, and we're here today talking to Adam Butler, who is, and hopefully I get this title right, Adam, the Turkey Program Coordinator.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
For the
Program Coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
Oh, I'm glad you said the rest of it because I couldn't remember at the moment whether it was Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks or Fisheries, Wildlife, and Parks. So
yeah, it gets confusing. Every state does it a little different. So I know you got to kind of keep that reference in the back of your head.
Right.
Yep.
But, Adam, it's your job, to spend 365 days a year, thinking about turkeys, not only in Mississippi, but you regularly convene and converse with turkey biologists from all over the country, both from other state agencies as well as academia. And we appreciate you coming on today to talk about some of your perspectives related to turkey population status in Mississippi, and maybe discuss a little bit about season frameworks and how that relates back to wild turkey biology, and sharing some of the data that you guys have been collecting at a statewide level for the past several years.
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm always quick to tell people, I'm not just a turkey biologist. I was a turkey hunter way before I was a biologist, and I'll be a turkey hunter way after. So it's not just my job. It's a personal passion of mine, which I think is probably shared by a lot of us in our profession. But I've been a turkey hunter in Mississippi since I was a little kid. One of my earliest memories is watching my dad shoot a bird when I was about 5 years old, and I've chased the things ever since. So thinking about turkeys 365, that's a good way to put it. One way or the other, I'm thinking about them 365.
Yeah.
But now you get paid to do it.
Yeah, whether you're on the clock or not. No, I came from a similar place in life, with the influence. I remember really early on turkey hunting with my dad and grandfather. But it's nice to talk to people like yourself and I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the turkey folks have gotten into the business is exactly what you're saying. Is we grew up turkey hunting and we loved the resource, and it led us down a path of in our case researching it in academia, in your case being the state program coordinator, and I just want to reiterate there's a lot of value that comes from that perspective. With biologists that grew up hunting the resource that they're now managing, there's a lot of perspective, and same thing for research. A lot of the ideas and things that I think about come from my time on a deer stand or on the side of a tree listening to turkeys. So
yeah. And I mean, I think when you consider the frustrations with especially trying to manage a resource like wild turkeys at a statewide level, you're not going to be able to maintain that level of devotion if you don't have an underlying passion for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nobody goes into the wildlife profession to get rich. That's for sure. You gotta love it.
Yeah, but you're also dealing with a resource and a constituency, and you have the perspective of the constituency.
Yeah,
I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because as we talk about harvest frameworks, I think a lot of times hunters and our constituents, can view the biologist or the state agency as just, some bureaucrat sitting in the Capitol building who are removed from sort of the end goal, which is to have more turkeys to hunt. But as much as I can, I try to dissuade that notion. Looking at our Wildlife Bureau staff here with Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, I mean, every single one of us is a hunter. So even though our role and our responsibility is policy that affects hunters, we're all looking at it through that lens as a hunter. because it's, so at the end of the day, it affects us too. And that really, if we get into talking more about frameworks and stuff like that, that very much paints, my perspective on it all. There's, every time you talk about, doing something with harsh frameworks, that actually is going to affect people in the field, real people, real experiences, real memories that could be made,
Absolutely. Maybe the best place to start is if you could just fill us in, especially for people that may not be as familiar with the state of Mississippi, kind of some background information on turkey populations and status over the years.
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna probably let my bias show a little bit here. I'm from Mississippi, grew up here, went away for a little while and came back. But I'm really proud to have the role I have, because Mississippi, I think, is pretty prominent in the turkey world for a lot of reasons. I've heard it called a blue chip turkey state, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Marcus, you being a fellow Mississippi State University alumni, MSU has a real rich history of turkey research going back to Dr. George Hurst, all the way back into the 80s. If we talk about Dr. Kinnemer, who most people will recognize his name from his longtime association leading to NWTF, he got his PhD at Mississippi State University working on turkeys. And that rich tradition of turkey science continues here to this day. Just in the last decade, we've done projects here on landscape ecology of turkeys, looking at the importance of hardwoods. We've looked at genetics. We've looked at we radio tagged birds, done all that, and now we're doing stuff looking at harvest modeling. So that component's there. My agency, before we were the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks, we were the Wildlife Conservation Commission. And, when our agency was formed in 1932, the restoration of wild turkeys was one of the very first things that the legislature tasked the agency with. So, almost from day one with our agency, turkeys were a central part of what we do. And I'm really proud of the fact that our state, was one of the first states to really undertake turkey restocking and restoration. Not the only one, but we were certainly one of the early states to do that. And we had our restocking program going on, in the mid 1950s, and it really got underway in a big way in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And by the mid 1980s into the early 1990s, we were largely done with turkey restocking. And if you look around the United States, there was a lot of places where things were just taking off then. So we have a really long tradition there of turkey science, of turkey management, going all the way back through restocking. And I think that has enabled a really deep, rich turkey hunting tradition that you don't necessarily see everywhere. Now, Will, you being in Alabama, I think Mississippi and Alabama both kind of share a lot of that tradition. But I mean, if you look at Mississippi, people who are familiar with turkey hunting, there's all kind of names that are going to come up. Primos, Mossy Oak, Preston Pittman, Jack Dudley. I mean, all sorts of really prominent fixtures in kind of the greater turkey hunting industry and world, have a Mississippi connection one way or another. So that's something that's really important to me. I'm really proud of, and I feel like our state has always, kind of been a leader in wild turkey research, management, hunting, all of those things mixed in together. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously have a pretty biased perspective, but I just feel like Mississippi and Alabama are there like 1 and 2 with each other as far as, the OG, if you will, turkey states.
Yeah. And again, like going back to kind of the ancient history of that, I mean, parts of Mississippi and Alabama never really lost turkeys. And I don't know, there's a lot of states in the country that turkeys were completely extirpated from, and the restocking that they did had to come from sources outside of their state. That was never the case here. And I'm pretty sure that was not, Alabama was similar in that way, that there were always some pockets of turkeys that remained. If you look at Mississippi, the very southeast part of our state, all the way up kind of the Alabama border into east central Mississippi, always had turkeys, has always had a spring turkey season. There was There was 1 year during World War II where the state stopped the spring season, but outside of that, we've hunted turkeys in the springtime, as far back as you want to look. And so, again, that just goes to that tradition that we have here, and it's a big deal here. It's a big deal in other places in the country, and turkey hunting is one of the few forms of hunting that's really grown a lot in recent years. So, that those traditions are taking hold in other places, but they've been here for generations. And I think Alabama's probably in that same place.
Will's been making an ongoing joke that he's going to call me Dr. Bartram. But even in the historical writings, they with Bartram and some others, but there's one quote that I found from Bartram talking about his travels through the South, and it was around that same time he was talking about the Herald of the Morning and all that. But he said that, and I'm pretty sure the center of the range was Alabama and Mississippi together. In the states that he talked about being the breadbasket of turkeys.
Yeah, I got one on par with that. John James Audubon, obviously, probably almost everybody's heard the name Audubon, and all his paintings. He was based out of New Orleans for much of his career in the 1700s. Yeah. But he did a lot of his paintings in Mississippi. And there's good reason to believe, like some of that famous painting that he has of the wild turkey, that was probably done from a turkey that was taken somewhere around Natchez, Mississippi. And he's got some writings about, the turkey flocks he was encountering there in Mississippi. So, we were talking.
Yeah, I've read a lot about
a couple hundred years ago with some very prominent American naturalists that were talking about turkeys in my home state. So, I'm pretty proud of our state when it comes to wild turkeys.
Yeah, we got to celebrate when we get a chance because, Alabama, Mississippi, we get ranked last in almost every other category. So we'll take turkeys.
Yeah, that's a pretty good one to be up at the top of. There's probably a few listeners out there that disagree, that are from a different state or whatever.
Good turkey hunting versus quality public education. I'm cool with turkey hunting.
Well, it depends on what you call education. I would say that a lot of my education as a youngster on the tree listening to turkeys was pretty high quality education.
Yeah, a natural education, right?
Yeah.
So I think too, one thing that I think Mississippi can offer to sort of the wider turkey world is, again, going back to the fact that we undertook and largely completed restocking and restoration pretty early on as compared to a lot of the country. Our population, peaked, or at least one of the peaks was in the 1980s. And so, I know there's a lot of hand wringing right now around the country about turkey populations, particularly in some of the states where the restoration was later and where the sort of that exponential boom phase was happening in either the late 90s or the early 2000s. And those populations may have peaked in the last 10 or 15 years. We've got a little bit longer look at that where, we saw some pretty high peaks in the 1980s. And from the late 80s or say the early 90s, 90, 91, 92 to about 94, we did see some very dramatic drops in harvest and things like that. And then things kind of stabilized and bounced around again. And then they came back up in the early 2000s. So, looking at the data that we have available over like that longer time horizon, you do sort of see some downtimes, but you also see some times where things come back. And so to me, that adds a little bit of perspective. If you're in one of those states where you're just now coming off of that boom and almost anywhere it happens, it seems like after turkeys are restocked, they have about a 20 to 30 year window where they just go through the roof and they hit this peak where the numbers are just absurd. And there's just, there's turkeys in every stretch of woods, and every field's got a big flock. And you hear people talking about numbers like, I saw a flock of 100 and that kind of thing. Almost everywhere, it seems like somewhere around that 20 to 30 year mark, that can't sustain itself, and you have some sort of a drop off. But I think the point that Mississippi would offer to that is that that's not necessarily indicative of it's going to drop forever, or that, that it's not potentially going to come back, and there's going to be these fluctuations that you have over time as those populations stabilize.
So in other words, that after that peak, that downturn, even though it may be 20 or 30 years, is not necessarily spelling the demise of
right. We're not dealing with a threatened and endangered species here.
Right.
And they're going to have some good times. They're going to have some bad times, and having, in our state, that longer perspective, you do see some of that. And now, what we really see is that there's a lot of regional fluctuation within the state. There's some regions of Mississippi where I think we've got pretty stable populations. There's some regions of the state where I think we do have some declining populations for reasons we might want to get into. And then there's other parts of the state where, there's probably as many birds right now as there have been in a really long time. We talk about the kind of the boom and bust cycle that we experience in the lands along the Mississippi River. But some of those properties right now today have as many turkeys as they've probably had in 20 years. So, it's sort of all over the map when you get down to kind of the local level. But that, again, I think that's part of what happens after a population sort of peaks out and it hits this phase where it's going to fluctuate. And now you've got all these things that are interacting to cause these local level ups and downs and stuff.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we were just talking about this in relation to some data that Dr. Craig Harper from University of Tennessee shared with us, where he showed a figure depicting turkey populations in Tennessee, and it looked like the classic, logistic growth curve that you see in Wildlife Biology 101, where you've got this really low population, restocking occurs, you get an exponential growth rate for some number of years, and then you start to see that growth rate slowly, the population's still increasing, but at a decreasing rate. Then you hit a carrying capacity and you fluctuate around that. And it was making me wonder, and we were kind of speculating in the conversation about that data, as to whether or not states that had restocked later were further along or not as far along as the ones who had restocked earlier. And that's why, as you get up into as you go further to the east and to the north, that it does seem to be the case that they haven't experienced declines yet, or they're experiencing declines in harvest, at least, later than other states have. And I think you just spoke directly to that.
Yeah. And you can see that with us at like the statewide level. If you look at our statewide harvest, you see the big exponential growth through, like I said, in our case, through the 70s and early 80s. And then we kind of hit this plateau and come off of it. And then we fluctuate a little bit. But within our state, the restocking process happened generally in a south to north fashion. And I don't really exactly know why that was the case. Like I said, those decisions were made, 50, 60 years ago. And a lot of those guys who made those decisions are not around, so I haven't heard. But the bottom line is most of the southern and central part of the state was restocked before the northern part of the state. The very northern third of Mississippi didn't really get restocked until the 80s and early 90s. And so at the local level, you can look at like harvest data from our WMAs, and you see the pattern's the same. So the pattern of that, like you're talking about, that exponential growth in harvest, reported harvest from hunters, and then that stabilization, and some of them, come off of that. Some of them it's pretty dramatic, come off of the boom. But within our state, that's happening at different times. So like some of the WMAs we have in the very north part of the state that were the last to get restocked, the shape of that, of that curve in the data, in the harvest data, is the same as in the south. It's just separated by 2 decades, So it for whatever reason, that's the pattern that turkeys follow after restoration. I wish somebody could figure out why they can't sustain the high, but it seems to me that almost in every case, they're not able to sustain that initial boom, and they come back to some lower level that's, 15 to 30% lower than what the peak was. But it seems like that's ubiquitous across everywhere, like at the local level within Mississippi. And then if you compare, our harvest trend to, a state in the Midwest or a state in the far north of New England, it's the same trend. It's just happening at different times.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and definitely after talking to Dr. Harper and then talking to you about it, it's really interesting. It does shape out like that carrying capacity curve.
I'm seeing a paper here. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Marcus,
Well,
but looking at time from restocking and to time of peak harvest and then subsequent decline, I mean, that's really interesting.
Well, the other thing that may be operating and probably is operating at the same time is that carrying capacity level might change, right? And you may actually, if that changes, which Dr. Harper seemed to indicate in some of what he was saying with the increase in human populations, you're seeing a corresponding decline in the amount of area for a turkey to be raised in and live in. So, we got to keep those things in mind. It also kind of brings in another topic that we're planning on addressing directly with a few people who are experts in the area on density dependent factors. Yeah. I think we definitely need to go into that in more detail in some of these podcasts, but it's really interesting to hear your perspective.
That's the thing that keeps me up at night. Like, to me, it's clear that there is some sort of density dependent mechanism that's got to be kicking in, but I don't really know what that is, and I don't know if anybody knows what that is. Yeah. But if we could figure that out, it would go a long way to maybe clearing some of the confusion up, and hopefully, pulling out some nuggets that can be management items to tackle.
Yeah, no, I'm right with you, and just Will and I talk about this pretty commonly, and we've tried to target some of these issues like the season frameworks and predator trapping and density dependence. Another one. We've got lots of topics like that where we have enough uncertainty that there's a lot of real or perceived, depending on the topic area, disagreement among the professionals, the experts on it. You may have 2 or 3 experts on the same topic, and then they're saying different things to one another. And that's one of the things we want to do in this podcast is try to take some of these issues directly on and give everybody their voice, and let's hash out these things and let the hunting constituency that really cares about this resource understand these different perspectives and why we even have different perspectives on some of these issues.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think you do bring up a good point, like talking about carrying capacity, and you guys being deer guys, that means something.
Oh, he called us deer guys.
On our turkey science I don't have a deer podcast.
Well, but carrying capacity, as you think of it with deer, is a fairly well accepted notion, and I think we can probably define kind of what the things are that dictate deer carrying capacity and all that sort of stuff. With turkeys, it gets a little bit more squirrely to try to pin that down exactly what that is. I mean, we know what good turkey habitat is. We know what good brood habitat is. We know where they like to live and all those sort of things. But, we don't have a lot of good concrete examples of, in kind of an experimental way, changing something broad scale about the habitat and then measuring how that influences the birds and all that. I think that's somewhere we definitely need to go, forward. I mean, we know how to make brood habitat, but we don't really know how much of it we got to have and how much of it, at what point does it become limiting and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, documenting demographic responses to habitat management is something that's seriously lacking in the literature across all species, really.
Yeah. Well, again, with the quail world, they're getting better at that kind of stuff.
They're probably out ahead of everybody.
It is interesting. I know that I've had the conversation directly with both of you, and I think we've even to some degree on the podcast, and I know that I have with many other people, and you probably both have as well. It really is a hole in the literature. I think it's similar to the predator trapping issue that we just recently covered. And to me, that's like a dream thing that we need to, as researchers, all get together and try to tackle at a broad scale and a lot of different circumstances, but understand what that, this role of habitat is and how try to iron out some, not specifics, but some more general guidelines on what that looks like and how much we can expect to get out of it and how that compares to to other practices in isolation and also when they're paired together.
Right. And the frustrating thing about that with turkeys, and really it's true with all game birds, but turkeys especially, is because their populations are just by nature so erratic. They are going to go up and they're going to go down, and when they go up and they go down, it can be very dramatic in a real short period of time. And that is separate sort of from maybe like the long-term trends that you would see in habitat, over a big area, that are going to dictate how good that area is for turkeys over a span of, decades.
Right.
And so separating that out from the sort of the little short-term, up and downs that might be driven by rainfall in the springtime, or whether we have a drought or not, or, different sort of environmental factors that are going to drive that.
I think that's actually, that's another good point for us to internalize, just as, communicators, but also the folks listening at home, that if you're thinking about a turkey population as being a line, really what it is a super squiggly line. Like that's every year the points drop and bump really dramatically, or maybe it's a few year period, or depending on what species you're talking about. But that population at that shorter time scale is pretty erratic. And then we often kind of draw this line through that, and paint the broader picture of what the population's trending toward. But when we draw that line and then don't remember that it's super squiggly, then that year-to-year variation looks like, oh, this is going to be a big problem, when it's actually a very normal part of the way the population, especially with turkeys.
That's right. And looking around the country right now, all the concern that's out there with turkeys, you got to keep in mind that the crazy ups and downs are a feature, not a bug, of turkey populations. And that's something that's been known about for a long, long time. I mean, you can go back, to the 1950s with Wayne Bailey, one of the seminal turkey biologists. He at that time was studying populations in Virginia and West Virginia. And he was talking about, even then, their numbers going up or down by 50% of the long-term average from one year to the next. So, I mean, that's dramatic. Deer don't do that. The deer population may be going up or it may be going down, but it's going to do that relatively slowly over a long period of time. Whereas with turkeys, you may get, a bad roll of the dice on the hatch, and all of a sudden you're down 50% of what you were last year.
Yeah.
And to a hunter, that's huge. If you're managing a piece of property and 1 year you go out there and you've got 50% fewer turkeys, I mean, it's understandable that you're going to freak out. It's understandable that you're going to think the sky is falling, but in fact, that's just sort of part of what they do.
Well, even in a rising population, this is something else I'd like to go and look at those data, because I haven't paid attention to it very well. But even in these populations, when they're rising rapidly, like Craig showed us with the Tennessee population, I know you have data I've seen at some point like this as well in Mississippi. The population is still swinging from year to year, or over, cycling.
Yeah.
Where you have up and down years. And if you look at it,
and it's not only just driven by population size, but we see the spike in 2020 due to people having more time to turkey hunt. So there's all
other
sorts of sources of noise.
That's the other thing that's going on too. Like, especially at the state agency level, we don't have perfect data. All the data that we have has, some sort of bias associated with it. That doesn't mean it's bad data. You just got to recognize it's going to have its own issues, and you got to take all of it into context.
Yeah, and we can't measure anything perfectly either. So all that to say, the point I was trying to make is, even when the population was rapidly expanding and turkeys were hunky-dory, you still have up and down years during that. So that's one thing to keep in context. But the other part is, we could take a 10-year chunk of that, like you said, and it would be perfectly reasonable for a population that's doing just fine to have a 50% difference in the best year versus the worst year, right?
That's right.
Even though it's doing perfectly fine. But
the flip side of that is, and it's the same with any game bird, they have a really high reproductive potential. So when they get a good year and the stars align, you can go from not very many turkeys to a lot of turkeys in a really short window of time.
But I like when that happens.
And and that's what we keep your fingers crossed, and we wish we could control whatever drives that. I will tell you guys, we're sitting here recording this at the tail end of last quarter of 2020. We're coming off here, as measured by our brood survey, one of the best hatches we've ever had. And we've been recording brood. We've been doing our brood survey here since the mid 90s, and this hatch this year is going to go down as one of the top 1 or 2 or 3 that we've ever had.
So, oh wow, that's phenomenal.
2022 is the year of the turkey hatch. In all seriousness, this year, everywhere I have talked to people and asked about it, I'm hearing that, across several states, everybody's like, man, I got them this year. And state folks are doing that. That's really great. It makes me feel good.
You know what that tells me?
That we're going to have some good turkey hunting in a couple of years.
I was going to say, I need to get a Mississippi hunting license in 2024.
Yeah. Well, and too, you guys are probably more knowledgeable about population biology than I am. But, when you get one of these big boom hatches and their numbers just explode, from that point forward for a little while, the per capita rate of reproduction doesn't have to be as high. All of a sudden, you can go back to just having kind of an average hatch, but because you've got so many more birds on the landscape, they're going to maintain a little bit higher. And then, you go 3, 4, 5 years down the road and you get, a really bad stroke of luck and you get that 50% decline, and now you're back down there. So,
even in
they're
Mississippi,
frustrated. It's a lot of ups and downs and a lot of stuff that's hard to understand or, scratch your head about.
So given that that's the case, Adam, would you say that, some of the concern that people have about poult per hen ratios now compared to historically, I'm not going to say it's not justified, but maybe it's not as doom and gloom as it might be, because yes, there's fewer poults per hen, but there's more hens than there were, based on the decades ago population that they're comparing to. So you don't need as many poults out there to produce the same amount, poults per hen out there to produce the same amount of overall turkeys.
Right. Yeah. And that goes back to that whole density dependent thing, right?
Yeah.
At a high density, you don't have to have as much reproduction to get the same number of warm bodies on the landscape from year to year. I think that's a really good point to make. A lot of, at least from the biologists, a lot of the concern you see is because some of these states, and like I said, we've had a brood survey going on since the mid 90s. There's some states like Missouri, for instance, they've been recording poult per hen ratios since the 60s, and there's some other states that have had it that long. And so when you look at those sort of places, and back during that exponential growth phase, when they're coming off restocking, you do see these 3, 4 poult per hen numbers that they're producing, and then that number's steadily declining. We've never had, going back to the mid 90s, Mississippi's never had poult per hen ratios on par with some of that. Now, had we had data from the 60s to today, maybe we would have seen some of those 3, 4, 5 poult per hen ratios. But because we started the brood survey a little bit later, and like I said earlier, we were already done with restocking, and our population had essentially already peaked by the time we started recording brood data and poult per hen ratios. We never had some of those just drastically high numbers that you see in some states. The big question, I think, is like at what level does that poult per hen ratio have to be at a stable population? Like, what would you expect it to be? I think the conventional wisdom has generally been that it needs to be around 2. I tend to think we can probably get by with a little lower than that. I think maybe a 1.6, 1.8 is probably what you would have at a stable population. We're working with Dr. Dana Morin and Mark McConnell at MSU right now, doing some work modeling some population stuff, and that's kind of one of the things we're wanting to try to get at is exactly what poult per hen ratio do you have to have, because that very much will frame the conversation. I think to me it may be unreasonable to expect that those numbers that some of those states that have 50-year data trends on that what they were getting when those populations were going through the boom is what you should expect to have when they're at stability,
Well, yeah, we're very much looking forward to trying to get a hold of both of those folks to get them on the show, because we know they're very capable, and one of them I know is really keen on talking about density dependence. So I definitely think we should try to talk about that too. But so what did you say that you were thinking was the stable?
I think, well, in Mississippi's case, and I'll tell you why I think that. In Mississippi's case, we have, I think, pretty good monitoring data on turkey populations that we're getting from multiple sources.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the brood survey, and I think many listeners are probably familiar with that. That's where we get poult per hen ratios. We're recording them in the summertime. And, it's not a perfect data set. It's got its own biases and those sort of things. The other source of data that I put a lot of weight on in monitoring turkeys here, we call it spring gobbler hunting survey. It's some states call it avid hunter survey.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing that over the same time period we've been doing brood survey. So every year we send out a survey to about 1,500 turkey hunters statewide. And when they go out in the woods in the spring, they record how many turkeys they're seeing, how many turkeys they're hearing, that kind of data. And so in a given year, that usually will account for about 20,000 trips afield from all over the state. And since we began that monitoring survey, we've got over 500,000 records now, trips afield. And so usually with us, those two things corroborate one another really well. Like if the brood survey number goes up, usually the next year, the observations that the turkey hunters see will also go up. And you can, they align really well, if you do like a regression or something on them.
Mm-hmm.
And normally if that poult per hen ratio here gets up in the ballpark of about 1.8-ish, you're going to see a bump in observations from the turkey hunters in the following year. And you'll usually see a bump in harvest rate 2 years later when those birds become adult gobblers. So
2 years.
That's why I think here, I don't know, even though two poults per hen has always kind of been the conventional wisdom, I think just looking at what we've got, I think you can get by with a little bit lower than that. Now, one thing to keep in mind, like game birds in general, like if you look at the Southeast versus the North, there's probably going to be some differences. There's and it's not been well demonstrated with turkeys, but with some other game birds, the demographics that maintain a population in the South may not be the exact same demographics that maintain a population in the North. So just because that 1.8 may work here, that may not mean that that's what, Pennsylvania or New York needs to have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Similar to some of the discussion we had with the Predator episode.
Yeah, my immediate assumption or thought on that, and it's something I've never even heard mentioned before today, but my immediate reaction is to go to buffering against more overwinter mortality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it. And like I think the quail world has demonstrated that pretty well. That when you go north, you generally have higher overwinter survival. Higher overwinter mortality and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to have higher reproduction to maintain that. Whereas, here in the deep South, that may not necessarily be the case. So all that in the discussion of poult per hen just sort of means that the poult per hen ratio that may be what maintains a population over the long term might be different in the deep South than it is in the upper Midwest or something.
Mm-hmm.
Totally possible. Hey, you guys are researchers. That's something we need to figure out. Y'all get to work on that.
I'm over here just taking notes on all the project ideas I've already gotten in this, first 20 minutes of conversation.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. Well, I completely forgot why I asked you what you thought the sustainable thing was, because you went on a different path than I was thinking of, but it was really good stuff. I remember now. So you've got these hunters that are sending in surveys for the poult, the poult data, poult hen. And do you have that same data on the WMAs, or are they mixed together? Can you do you know what the private versus public poult per hen looks like?
Yeah, so our brood survey that we do in the summertime, that goes out to like everybody working for our agency. So that would be all of our biologists, WMA staff, conservation officers, those sorts. We send it out to the Forest Service. We send it out to private timber companies. And in recent years, we've also sent it out to sort of private citizens. That was not the way it was historically done, but to try to bump up sample size, we've been doing that for about 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So we are getting data from WMAs, and like it's denoted in there. We know that this observation came from a WMA. Usually the brood data is not, like, the sample size at the WMA scale is usually not enough to say something one way or another about the individual WMA.
Mm-hmm.
But we are getting all those observations from public and private land.
Yeah. Do you have a feel on how they compare to one another? That's something that I get asked about and I hear about a lot.
Usually that there's not huge differences in the two.
Okay, so you're not just seeing like a glaring difference in productivity.
No, not. I wouldn't say that. When I've looked at it in the past, it was not like a dramatic difference between the two.
While we're on the topic of public versus private, one of the things that you and I have been talking about is differences in harvest rates between the two. And I know you had mentioned that to Adam previously. That was maybe something we want to talk about today. Do you want to go into that now, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's really up to you, Adam, what you want to, where you want to go with it. I mean, we really want to talk about some of the work that you guys have been doing, and there's a broader question I think that is of interest to a lot of people, and that was one of the reasons I was curious about that productivity data. Is similar to what you're saying, Will. What does the harvest look like? And I think you have some from Mississippi, some good data kind of looking at the differences in what harvest looks like, and I think it's probably relevant to the conversation to know what does it look like generally on WMAs versus private lands in terms of the harvest pressure.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously there's a lot more hunting pressure on public lands than private lands. Not all private. I mean, some again, going back to Mississippi being a big time turkey hunting state, I say all the time, there's not a turkey in the state of Mississippi that gobbles that isn't getting chased by somebody. So there's a lot of hunting pressure almost no matter where you go. But obviously there's more on public lands that are open access where people can go day after day after day. Mm-hmm. And so what we see here, like on average across the state, if you want to take some of our harvest data and sort of back calculate it, we average about one turkey harvested per 1,200-ish acres across the state. And usually that's going to be higher than that on a WMA.
Is that based on total land area or just quote unquote huntable or? So basically suitable?
that's outside of the Delta. So if you're people who aren't familiar with Mississippi, the area that we call the Delta, which is the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, the floodplain of the Mississippi River, is very different than the rest of the state. And it's largely row crop ag dominated, very few woods. The few woods that are there are usually going to be around swamps or cypress breaks or something like that. So it's largely void of turkeys. Now there's a couple of places in there, like Delta National Forest and big tracts of bottomland hardwood that have birds. And then the area right along the margin of the Mississippi River, between the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River levee system, has some of the highest populations of turkeys we have. But the majority of what we call the Delta doesn't have a lot of birds. So when I say a turkey per 1,200 acres or so is what we average, that's outside of the Delta, basically in what is, turkey range within our state. So on WMAs, it's going to be a little bit higher than that. Depending on the WMA, most of them are going to average a bird per 600-700 acres, something like that. And then going back to that Spring Gobbler Hunter Survey stuff. So we have some of that information that's tied to individual hunting clubs, and we know that their information is coming from that. So like the really high end hunting clubs, the top tier, best turkey habitat, best parts of the state do really well, they may take a bird per 250 acres or something.
Oh, wow.
And so it runs the gamut, but again, it all comes back to sort of habitat quality at the local level. And, Marcus, like we talked about, even if we're talking about public land, there's a big gradient in between habitat quality on public land. Some of our public lands have very good turkey habitat and very stable harvest. Some of them, maybe lack some features that you would like to see to be the best. And so you got a big gradient there.
Yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind, is that we have this. It's not just like one of them's better than the other, or they're either group is similar. There's a wide variation in quality and productivity for turkeys. You may even be in a small geographic region, but it's still a wide variability in productivity that's consistently variable, I guess, on the private and public land. But you said something else that got my mind to racing a little bit. Were you saying, or can you say whether or not the harvest level, is that reflecting the quality of habitat and productivity? Like, it sounded like
what do you mean?
You were seeing a higher harvest rate on places that tend to have a higher productivity from the habitat stuff. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I think I understand you. So like when I'm talking about like the spring gobbler hunting survey data that's coming from hunters, like on private hunting clubs that are, well managed and doing everything right and all of that. You do see they tend to have, more gobblers harvested per unit of area than sort of the average. Like the average across that group is about a bird per 500, but the high end clubs are going to be a lot more than that.
So that's not just because you don't think that's just because it's a collection of people that are just way better at turkey hunting?
Well, there is that too. So there's you kind of tease all of that out. So I guess I just threw out a couple of different numbers that were coming from different sources. Like when I say like on average across the state, we average about a bird per 1,200 acres or so. That's like scattered all across the state. Like if you took our statewide harvest and then you just applied that to acres that are turkey habitat, that's the average across the state.
Well, I wasn't meaning to call into question anything. I realize you're having to paint with a broad brush. I was more trying to tease out, and then I was joking about the hunting thing, because like I'm not going to harvest that many birds per area with my level of skill, but there are probably other people that could, just because of differences in skill. But I was more just thinking, when you're having to paint with a broad brush. It sounded like the folks that are really putting a lot of effort into creating a high productivity thing or reaping some benefits from that, based on the data that you're collecting.
I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about turkeys, but certain properties definitely produce more turkeys year after year, and I mean, there's reasons why that happens.
And they're sustaining higher harvest. Even is
right.
I think where I ultimately wanted to get to is on those properties that are consistently producing more. They do have a five or six times as many gobblers per area, based on what you were saying, that they are sustaining over a long term. They're harvesting 5 or 6 times as many birds, and still have a lot of birds, which is
right. And they're still, just like we were talking about before, they're still going to have these year-to-year variations.
Sure,
there's still ups and downs and all that. But if you look at it from that way, the people who care a lot about turkeys and are doing a lot of the right things and are in the right landscape, I think that's something that gets overlooked too with turkey management, is that your ability to have a lot of turkeys is going to be dictated by a pretty big land mass around you. Like what your neighbors are doing down the road definitely influences your ability to have success. But all of those things, if you've got everything going right in a pretty big area, and then you're doing the right things on your property, definitely it pays dividends.
Yeah, that's really good information. We talked about that in similar contexts, where most people, in terms of for turkeys especially, but most people don't control enough land, to really have all the influence on the population be from their own effort. It's usually a collective effort between many landowners.
Well, and that's really interesting, and it's not exactly what I would have expected. It makes sense that you'd have a greater harvest density on well-managed private lands because it's capable of supporting that, right? But on the other side of the equation, you could see having a greater harvest density on public lands just because they receive so much more pressure. Mm-hmm. But harvest density is a function of a lot of things, including bird numbers, pressure, and all sorts of different, other lesser factors as well. But kind of, I guess one of the reasons we wanted to steer the conversation this way is because, when thinking about season dates and the effect of spring harvest of males on turkey productivity, we know that, if you kill 90% of your males the last week of March, you're probably going to have pretty poor reproduction, right? Or even 95%, like just as an extreme example. But as you back off of that, the question is like, where do you reach the tipping point where you still have enough males available just for the copulation events, right? And a lot of data in these turkey research projects, because they're state agency funded, the state agencies want those projects to be conducted on wildlife management areas, public land, because they have more control of those areas, even to implement some kind of manipulation, like we saw in the Tennessee study that we recently talked about with Dr. Harper. But this all kind of, I guess the point I'm trying to make, what I'm building up towards is, if harvest rates are have a much higher intensity on these public lands, that could be shaping the way that we see harvest intensity affecting reproduction, versus if it's lower elsewhere, it may not be at that threshold that would affect reproduction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in other words, you may not see the same pattern that we observe in these studies because they're on public land compared to private land because of the differences in that context.
Right. And if you look at the turkey literature and the research that's been done, and there's a lot of it, it's overrepresented on public land. I don't know what the percentage would be, but the vast majority of turkey research that has been done in the United States has been done on public land. And you guys are researchers, you probably understand why, but largely because public lands are, you're dealing with a larger property holding, that you only got to deal with one property ownership. You don't have to coordinate with a whole bunch of different landowners to get on the place. It's something that's going to remain in the same ownership type for a long period of time. If you guys got funding to do a $100,000 turkey research project and put a bunch of birds on a piece of private property, and all of a sudden that private property sold and the new landowner didn't want to do that anymore, that's a problem for research. So there's a reason why most of the past work has been done on public land, but the point is to be made that that's where a lot of the information does come from.
We don't know what private landowners are doing on their land, and they may not want the state or the university to be on their land interrupting turkey season or whatever. So that problem gets magnified when you go to private land, because the landowner's usually the one that gives you permission is usually a smaller landowner in terms of their contiguous acres they have control over compared to the state or federal land. And then you just magnify that problem where you have a bunch of competing interests that you're going to have to deal with when you're trying to do the study. So I certainly have seen that and heard it from many researchers trying to do this kind of work, where we get, I think it's pretty easy to understand, I guess, why we would focus a lot of effort on public land, but there's also, I think, a reasonable concern of how well that applies to both landscapes.
Sure.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to dismiss that research because it was done on public land. We just need to make sure that we discuss it in the proper context.
Yeah, it's just like what you were saying earlier, Adam, that every data set, every experiment, they always have weaknesses because we can't do everything. If we were going to do this in an ideal world, we'd have every turkey marked and know what happened exactly, but that's just not feasible. So we know there's weaknesses, and we need to be cognizant and acknowledge those weaknesses and try to deal with them as best we can.
But I mean, Will, you brought up a good point. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about season frameworks and how they affect turkeys and things like that. And, I addressed the elephant in the room here. I'm sitting in Mississippi who, we have the longest season in the country, and we're one of the earliest openings in the country. I think the South Zone of Florida opens earlier than us, and we used to open concurrent with Alabama, but there's been slight shifts there. The issue of harvest and harvest frameworks is something that's important to us. And it's something we recognized for a while. We, about 10 years ago, really started down the road of trying to develop a strategic plan for turkeys and what we wanted to address and all that. And we went through a lot of stuff to try to get to that. If folks want to see it, it's on our website. You can see our Mississippi Comprehensive Wild Turkey Management Plan. But, it lays out in there that we need to look at spring season stuff and try to understand the effect of our spring season, given that it's so liberal and there's concerns out there about turkey populations and all that. And so we've really been checking a lot of the boxes that plan laid out to sort of evaluate our spring framework. Now, one of the first things that happened when that plan was developed and adopted, we did not have a harvest reporting system here. In other words, and this probably sounds crazy to some folks in other parts of the country, but Hunter could, when Hunter shot a turkey, he'd take the turkey home, and that was the end of it. And since then, in 2019, we implemented a game check system where hunters are mandatorily required to report their harvest. And that was important in this bigger picture because that then was able to give us information about the breakdown of harvest within the season, better information about, who's killing one bird, two birds, three birds, those sort of things. And it was one of the first steps in us trying to, evaluate our spring season framework. The other thing we did, we decided, before we go down the road of trying to implement anything at a statewide level, let's test some things at a more local level. And so in 2019, we embarked upon kind of an experiment where we changed some frameworks on some WMAs. And we took a subset of our WMAs and we shifted the season back several weeks. And then each of those had a paired control WMA that was, kind of like kind nearby, same size, same habitat, everything that would make you think those two areas should be kind of analogous to one another. And
just before you go, so you were tracking some data on those before you implemented those changes?
Yeah. So hunters on our WMAs are recording the same sort of observational data that I was referencing with the Avid Hunter survey earlier. So, they're telling us how many turkeys they're seeing and how many turkeys they're hearing, how many jakes they're coming across, how many they're harvesting, and all of that. And we got that data set going way back. And so you can compare the two. You can compare the areas where we changed the season on, and you can compare the areas that stayed with the season framework. And I don't know what we expected at the onset of that, and we're kind of on the very back end of wrapping up some of the analysis of some of that, see what has happened. But bottom line, there does not seem to be dramatic changes between those two areas in terms of things like the number of turkeys people are encountering on those areas, the number of harvest per unit of effort, that sort of stuff. Even Jake observations, which we hope to use as sort of like a metric of recruitment. If we move the season back, did it increase reproduction on those areas and recruitment? That's not different between the control and treatment. So, our approach to trying to evaluate the season has been, we want to be sure if whatever we do, we want it to be data driven. And we don't want to make changes that are going to take opportunity away from hunters in the woods if we can't demonstrate some sort of rate of return, that they're going to get out of that. And in addition to that, we've been working with MSU on some modeling, some harvest models that basically like the easy way to describe that is basically allow us to play what if games where we put all of this data into this model and then say, okay, what if we, reduce the bag limit? What if we reduce the length of the season? What if we did this? And then, see what the projections are. And again, even with that, we don't see that things about the spring season are making dramatic differences in what we expect the number of birds on the landscape to be down the road. So, that's been our process. And I know, there's been a lot of actions in a lot of places in recent years with spring hunting frameworks and people being, concerned about turkey populations and potentially rightfully so. But our approach here has been that we have this long tradition of very liberal season frameworks, and that goes back decades and decades. We've got opinion survey data here from hunters that show that they like the status quo. Surprisingly, even though we have the longest season in the country, we did an opinion survey just a few years ago, and we had more hunters, even though we're already the longest season in the country that opens, one of the earliest openings in the country, we had more respondents in our opinion survey who thought our season should be longer than it currently is, than who thought it should be shorter than it currently is. Well, we had more respondents who thought that our season should open earlier than it currently does than later. And so, coming from our place as a state agency who's managing this public trust resource for the hunters, when you see information like that, hey, they like the long liberal opportunity, they like the season that starts pretty early in the breeding season. There was in that survey, one of the things we asked for the people who said that they think the season should open later, we asked them, like, if they responded that way, we asked them a series of options of dates that they think that, okay, you want it later, what date would you like it to be? And basically each date was backed up by a week off of what our current framework is. There was not a single respondent. The response rate was 0 of people who wanted to shift it all the way back to like when peak nest incubation would be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in Mississippi's case, we're coming from this place where we've had a long tradition of very liberal opportunity, very long opportunity. We're coming from a place where the hunting public, as they've described to us, does not want massive changes to the framework. And so that led us to believe, okay, if we're going to go down this road of evaluating season, we really got to dot our I's and cross our T's before we do something. And, we don't want to take our opportunity away if we can't demonstrate that it's going to have a return that hunters are going to appreciate. And so those, that WMA experimental stuff that I talked about, and then the harvest modeling stuff, that's been our way of kind of moving forward to evaluate that sort of thing. And again, neither of those are showing us, at least at this moment, that there's a whole lot of promise there in that being the things that are going to drive the number of turkeys.
So is that
change the number of turkeys on the landscape or anything like that?
So with your manipulation on the WMAs, you're 4 years post now?
Exactly.
Yes, 2022 was the 4th year into that.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so that's a little bit longer than the Tennessee study has been. But again, we know, and I think we should just put it out there, there's always strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
But, some of the strengths of this is the design. Mm-hmm. That you have that before after control impact, and that's a beautiful thing in a long-term data set. Some of the weaknesses, as we've all discussed, is you don't have direct measurements of reproductive parameters, but you do have some good indices like the Jake recruitment, for instance, that are a little bit later down the road, but they're a pretty good indicator of how many birds are getting or successful, and probably a better indicator even of some of the other metrics we use of how many are getting recruited into the gobbling.
But on
gobbling population.
On the flip side of that, the strength of that data type is that hunter observations of birds, sighting birds, hearing birds is that's your goal, right? To increase that. Yeah. That's the metric we're ultimately interested in.
Right.
More sightings, more gobbles, more harvest. Mm-hmm. But so far they haven't documented increases in those.
Yeah, and the important thing to note about that, we're evaluating that through hunter observational data. And you could poke holes in that. There's biases with it, but those biases are going to be consistent across the controls and the treatment. So the areas that got moved back and the areas that stayed the same have the exact same bias.
Right. And that's one of the beautiful strengths of that type of design, is that you have problems, but you've standardized those problems so that you can, more accurately measure responses to a treatment. And I think that's a really important thing. Another thing I wanted to point out is yours is on public land, and a lot of the stuff I think that Dr. Harper was talking about was on private land, as far as I remember. I know some of it was on public land, some is on private, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember the breakdown.
But anyway,
and I think it's really cool, because that I'm somewhat familiar with what they're doing in Tennessee, and the two I think will complement one another. Yeah. Even though they're very similar in the treatments that got done, moving the season back and all that. Yeah. But they're very different in the type of data they're collecting.
Right.
And so
that's where I was getting to.
It's going to be a good complement to one another.
Yeah. So now we have what I was going to get into is the context is very different, and I'm not sure about the public-private part of it, but the data that they are collecting versus the data that you're collecting are very different kinds of data, but very similar strengths in the experimental design. And I guess it sounds like they're fairly consistent in terms of what you've seen so far. And I know they and yours is still preliminary. You haven't finished everything, and we want to talk to Dr. Moran and Dr. McConnell about it further when that's more complete and been through peer review and all those sorts of things as well. But it is interesting to kind of for us to look at it early, where these are some of the earliest data sets looking at in a controlled way shift in the seasons, and you haven't seen that much demographically from the birds, it sounds like.
Yeah. Adam,
I think. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I had one more question about the study design. How long was the delay on those areas, and how closely did that coincide with average initiation dates of laying?
So that's a good question. So those WMAs got moved back to April the 1st.
Okay.
Which, we've got a lot of historic telemetry data here in Mississippi. So that's still before the bulk of the hens are nesting. We know from research here that most hens are not nesting until mid-April, April 15th, 20th, somewhere around there. And, basically the dates are pretty similar no matter where you're at in the Southeast, that kind of April 15th to 20th to 25th, somewhere in there. So you could argue that, we weren't directly testing the hypothesis about early season harvest, but, you got to also keep in mind some of the opinion data that I mentioned earlier. We already knew that the hunters from the opinion survey stuff we got seemed to have no interest in going all the way back to what the nesting date would have been, right? And so we felt like, well, we need to shift it back. Where can we shift it to that's a reasonable alternative that would be able to make its way into policy at the statewide level, and let's test that at a small scale. And so that's why we ended up there.
Gotcha.
Yeah, well, it also is interesting, and I think it's great insight into the state agency that you're really you're trying to serve the people and the resource at the same time, and you need to put together things that are going to be popular, not necessarily popular, but at least not completely 100% unpopular, unless like you're saying, there's 0% of people who want to move the season back that far. But if it's warranted, you need to know really well biologically it's warranted before you can defend that position.
Right, and that was like our whole that was our whole thought process. It was when we started down the road, honestly, we expected we were going to see positive results. That we did not start where we've ended up in terms of our thinking. We thought we'll do this, it will show some positive results, and that will frame a bigger conversation.
So basically, if we need to move the dates biologically, we're going to demonstrate that because we know it's not going to be popular. So we,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know, you need to have the data.
I look at it as give the hunters what they want as long as it's biologically defensible.
Right. They don't want the turkey population to decline to the point they can't hunt them either.
Right.
So, you know, that's a little bit longer term perspective, but that's what you're trying to make sure. Okay, biologically, is this something that's needed so that we can have a sustainable resource? Because ultimately, the hunters would rather have that and start a couple weeks later than not be able to take their grandkids because there aren't turkeys anymore.
Absolutely.
Right. And I get it. I mean, and we hear that a lot, you know, that we got to do something, or, you know, we need to reduce the season because the turkeys are declining, all these sort of things. I hear that. And what I hear people say when I hear that is they're worried about the future of the turkey population. Mm-hmm. And we all should be. If we're serious about being conservationists and hunters, we all should be worried about where turkeys are going to go in the future. I mean, there's not a single game bird east of the Rocky Mountains that is not declining in some or part of its range, you know? And so there's a lot of legitimate reason to be concerned. But, you know, our take was people in Mississippi are pretty serious about turkey hunting. And we have this really long tradition of being very liberal and providing a lot of opportunity. And we're a very conservative state politically. And that means, you know, we usually want people to make decisions at the most local level possible. And in a place that's 90% private land, that's going to be, you know, at the landowner level. So our agency has traditionally taken that view and you know, not just with turkeys, but with all game species, kind of taken that view of it. We're 90% private land, very conservative state. Let's allow maximum flexibility to the landowner to make decisions as they see fit. And so, you know, if that's where you're starting from, and if you think where you need to go may be a reduction of that, you better come with some pretty strong data to justify it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where we were, and that's why we started the case study in the way we did, so that, you know, we could either provide some information to support making some shifts, or say, hey, it didn't really work here, so we're skeptical about pushing it to a bigger scale.
Yeah. Well,
one thing I do. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to lead up, and maybe what you were going to, because I know we've talked about this before, but I was just thinking, okay, well, you know, there's a lot of different reasons why you might want to move the season, and one of them is biological in nature, that we're trying to make sure that we're not impacting turkeys negatively, but from the biological standpoint. But are there other reasons that you might want to move it?
Yeah, sure. And that I'm glad you brought that up. That was where I was wanting to go. So one thing that's interesting to come out of this, looking at those WMAs, and again, this I'm telling you all this. We're recording this in the fall. I don't know when this will come out, but you know, the final data analysis and polishing is not totally done yet. So I may be speaking a little out of turn right now, but what you do see in the WMAs that were moved back is that hunters hear a little bit more gobbling. They're not seeing more turkeys. They're not harvesting more turkeys. They're not seeing more jay like that. But you do hear a little bit more gobbling activity per time spent in the woods. And so the thought there is, it's not because there were more turkeys in the woods. It's because we're starting the season right at the time when gobbling is peaking. So Mississippi, we got really good gobbling data. I've mentioned several times in the last hour or so about our spring gobbler hunting survey data. So we got, you know, 500,000 trips of field where people are recording their gobbling. So we know really, really well within the season when gobbling peaks. And then we did a project about 10 years ago where we looked at, we did gobbling surveys but outside of the season, from mid-February all the way to the 1st of June. So we know what gobbling is doing outside of that. And in our state, you do see a pretty big gradient in, I say big, not that big. You see a difference between the south part of the state and north part of the state in terms of gobbling activity. The southern part of the state, gobbling activity is going to ramp up really fast, and it's going to peak somewhere in the last week or so of March. The northern part of the state, it's a little bit later than that. It's usually April 1st or maybe April, the first week of April sometime. So if you move the season back so that it's starting and basically coinciding with when gobbling is peaking, that turkey that would have woken up on March the 15th and gobbled 6 times and then got shot, he's going to wake up and gobble 40 times before he gets shot on April the 1st. And so, if you look at that type of data, that type of observational data, like I'm talking about, like at a per time spent in the woods, you hear a little bit more gobbling. It's not because there's more turkeys. It's just because they're gobbling more. You're holding off reducing the number of birds till right at peak gobbling. So you're going to hear a little bit more. And so that's one of those things that, we do have to take into consideration, because like you say, I mean, there's these biological things. How does hunting affect the population biologically? Is harvest sustainable? Is it affecting the number of turkeys you see over a long period of time? Is it affecting whether they're going up or down? I feel like we've kind of answered that and said, it doesn't really look like the harvest framework is a key driver of that system. But when we time the season and all of that can influence, how much gobbling people are hearing when they're in the woods. And so those are conversations that we're going to have as a staff. How do you balance those two things? And as we're recording this here today, we've not kind of came to a resolution on that. But that's something that's important to consider, is the hunting quality aspect of it.
Yeah,
those are all the human dimension side of it and the biological side of it kind of all get rolled in together to come up with recommendations. So it's possible that at the end of the day we may still offer some tweaks to our system or to our season. I don't know where we're going to end up landing, but that's what I've laid out over the last 20 minutes or so has kind of been our approach, where we wanted to be very, very meticulous and cautious and really try to gather as much information as we can before we come to a conclusion.
Right. What was the all start date this year, Adam?
It's been March the 15th for basically since 2005. We've been at March the 15th. Prior to that, we were around March 18th or 20th for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm just thinking about the gobbling data we collected in Alabama this year. It was like I feel like it was like those last 5 to 7 days of March when we really saw gobbling ramp up in Alabama.
But that was statewide, right, on yours?
Yeah. But I mean, I think further validates Adam's point that they could be starting right now a little bit before that. I mean, there's still a lot of gobbling going on that week that they start, but if I remember correctly, we saw it really peak the following week here in Alabama.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, it differs depending on where you are here in our state. Like another thing that, because we opened so early, that very first week of our season, a lot of times, just the weather is still kind of squirrely right then. You're still getting some of those winter fronts and things like that. And usually by that last week of March, most years we've settled more into a kind of a typical spring weather kind of a pattern, and that influences gobbling rates and how they're acting and how hunters are experiencing it and all that too.
Sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I mean, that's that last week or so of March for a lot of Mississippi is going to kind of be prime time. The very northern part of the state, it's a little bit later than that.
Yeah. The other thing, I know you've talked about it before, but I think it's something that's important. One, that I think it's important for everybody to realize how important it is to you, as I'm just saying, you representing the state, how important it is to improve and maintain hunter satisfaction as the constituents, and that has lots of roles. It's not just for the sake of hunters being satisfied, but also to retain hunters because they're so important in the conservation aspect, from financially and keeping that interest. But another thing that you said one time that resonated with me is related to youth hunting, and I think that was another thing. Right now, the youth hunting doesn't really line up right.
Yeah. So again, y'all are catching me a little bit premature on some of this because we're right now
trying to
in ongoing conversations as a staff about where we want to go. Traditionally, our youth season. So we have a week-long youth season here. And traditionally, that week-long youth season has overlapped with the time when most schools are out for spring break.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, that season's been in place probably since around 2000, somewhere in there, late 90s, 2000s. For reasons that I don't really know, most of the schools in the state, and I've actually, I spent a chunk of an afternoon looking at the calendars for each school district in the state. Most of our schools have shifted the spring break back a week in the last 2 years. And so now that youth week doesn't align with the spring break week when the kids are out and could go hunting. And so, again, that's not a biological factor. That's not something to think about in terms of what turkeys are doing, but that makes a big difference in those kids' ability to get in the woods and that sort of thing. And so that's, that's another one of those sort of outside the biology components that you got to think about as a state agency and setting seasons and stuff.
Well, and I know that you guys are trying to deal with a lot and figure out what you're going to do, and I'm not really prodding on trying to get at what you decide, but I'm trying to more bring to light there are some really important reasons to consider what season timing is, even if it's not biological. And while we're all sitting here, we want this resource to be sustainable in time, and hunting, keep maintaining hunting interest and recruiting new hunters is, from the long-term standpoint, very important for turkeys and the conservation of the species and maintaining the traditions and cultures, that have been built around this species. And to me, that's something that really resonates. Is when I was a kid, I used to use spring break to go turkey hunting, just like you're saying. I grew up in West Alabama, and that was, spring break week was when I was going to go hunting, and that was an important part of me developing into who I am now, and passionate. And I think there are probably a lot of people like this that are super passionate about this species, and it starts from stuff like that. Having that opportunity, and the fact that I was out of school right then at the first week of season and was able to go with my granddaddy and sit. We had a place called the Blackfield. We'd go sit in his little truck, and we would listen, because at that time he wasn't getting around extremely well already. And I can remember sitting in that little red Toyota with him and listening. We were kind of on a little mound in the property, and you could hear the turkeys all around the property. And I can remember sitting there, and it just resonates with me. And that's something that I really appreciate, is that we need to be thinking about how are we going to get kids the best opportunity to experience that and develop the next wave of passionate turkey hunting conservationists, that a lot of us experienced when we were kids. And I just wanted to bring that up, not because I'm suggesting you should make a decision at the state level based on that, but it is, those kinds of things I think are really important and probably not thought about enough or valued enough.
It's so hard too, because if you don't let the kids, or even hunters in general, hunt during that period of time, or some period of time, you restrict their season down, those memories are never made. Mm-hmm. But also, if you give them too much opportunity and access, then those memories are never made for a different reason. We overharvest the population. So I think that in and of itself just kind of describes the balancing act that state agency biologists faced.
Yeah, it's definitely really tricky.
While we have this second or that thought, I do want to give kudos out to our commission, because they've and that it works different in every state, but here in Mississippi, ultimately the commission are the ones that make the decisions. They're appointed by the governor, and my job as a biologist is simply to make recommendations to them. But they have been very generous on the issue of turkey season frameworks and stuff with us, and been very willing to be patient and let the process play out. Give us as a staff of biologists time to collect the information and gather it all and really evaluate it. And I'm very appreciative of them of that, because I know, you look around the country, there's a lot of concern, and there's a lot of pressure to make adjustments, to make changes. People, hunters, they want an easy fix, and our commission has been willing to kind of let this process play out. So I just want to say I'm very appreciative of that and that relationship.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. It's definitely, a lot of. I mean, that's why we wanted to cover it. There's a lot of interest and concern from multiple angles on this issue, and we will ultimately want to do what's biologically appropriate, but also what is going to maximize hunter satisfaction and interest, and make sure that we maintain that. Because I mean, I don't know that we've talked about it in enough detail, or if people have heard it, but there are a lot of examples of species that we still have or still are abundant because we have maintained an interest in that species. I'm talking about globally. From a hunting standpoint, there are a lot of species that hunting has been a really big part of the conservation of not even just that species, but a whole community of species that might be associated with the same type of land or land use or whatever. There are lots of examples. And I think it's important
circling
to maintain
all the way back to kind of how we started this conversation talking about Mississippi. I mean, I think part of the reason that Mississippi and Alabama, have such deep, rich cultures that we have is because we've always allowed a lot of time for hunters to get into the woods, and that that builds those memories and those experiences, and fosters the rise of that culture that produces some of the household hunting names that come out of our two states. So yeah, for sure. I mean, that's something that I think you definitely gotta be aware of, and be sure to try to not erode. I mean,
right.
Obviously we got to be sensitive to the biology and the sustainability of the resource, but we want to make sure the hunting culture is sustainable too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, they're inextricably linked. You have to figure out a way to balance them.
What else? Adam, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today? Any questions that we've missed?
I did want you to drop some pins on some of those turkeys that are not hunted very hard. You said there's probably
I don't know about
few.
that, man. Like I said, I think if a turkey gobbles here in Mississippi, somebody knows about it. So.
Yeah. No, I definitely have really appreciated all this conversation, and if there's any other things that you would want to bring up, or data or anything that we haven't covered that you would like to.
Well, I know you guys are having a much bigger series of conversations about turkey science than this one you've had with me today, but I think we've hit on it kind of in different ways today. But I think it's important to remember turkeys are a game bird, and if you dive very deep into the game bird world, whether you're talking about turkeys or quail or grouse or any of those birds that lay a nest on the ground and have chicks that come out of the egg immediately able to feed themselves, they're all driven by reproduction. They're all dependent upon those early successional habitat types to get through that important period. And turkeys are no different. And we hunt turkeys at a time of the year that's a little different from a lot of those. But like I said a second ago, I mean, whether you're talking about quail in the southeast, or you're talking about some of the prairie grouse in the Great Plains states, whether you're talking about rough grouse in the Appalachians, whether you're talking about pheasants in Kansas, a lot of those species are declining. And they're declining because they've lost those habitats that are important for the nesting and the brood rearing. And, turkeys are dependent on the exact same thing. And so, keep that in mind. What affects those species is probably affecting turkeys to some degree. And when it comes to those species, we focus a lot on habitat. You don't hear people talking about helping pheasant populations by reducing harvest on pheasants. You talk about helping pheasant populations by increasing CRP and increasing the types of habitats that they use. And I think the same thing can be said for turkeys. If there's a problem with turkeys, the solution at the end of the day is going to be more brood habitat on the landscape at a big scale. And that's not an easy fix, but that's probably the right fix.
Well, I think ultimately, this should resonate with people that I would much rather be able to shoot the same number of turkeys and hear more turkeys gobbling rather than to stabilize the population by reducing opportunity to hear gobbling and harvest. I would much rather increase productivity, in other words, than decrease opportunity to stabilize the population or ensure that it's sustainable or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the tougher road to go down, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
Yeah. It's definitely harder to organize that, especially at a state level.
Right.
A concerted effort from the many different interests. Some people are living off of their land. There are all kinds of competing interests that make that difficult. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'd much rather make more turkeys than take less.
Mm-hmm.
So the take home is burn your woods, right, Marcus?
Set it on fire. Yeah.
Right. We need more fire.
Yeah, fire. I've done my fair share of promoting that, but something that you said that also resonates with me, and I was thinking through it. A lot of our species of conservation concern, and I would include turkeys into that, but we've got all these species that are benefiting from a very similar thing, and to me, that's as a wildlife.
Neotropical migrant birds. I mean,
we could just add layers and layers of species that people don't even know that they care about, really. But the thing about it is that's really cool is once you go in and start implementing that stuff, and then all of a sudden you start seeing indigo buntings and whatever, all this different stuff, then people start to really appreciate it. And I've seen some folks get giddy about seeing some cool neotropical migrant that they never even knew they didn't have. But turkeys, part of their biology, like you're saying, this limiting factor across the landscape affects positively a whole swath of species that aren't doing very well, and that definitely resonates with me.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I really hammer on, particularly early succession and fire, and those are the things that are missing in the landscape that aren't just affecting turkeys, but this whole suite of other species.
Right. And I mean, to wrap all that up, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, about the effect that harvests may or may not have on reproduction. And we've kind of touched on it. There's a lot of work being done right now to sort of evaluate that hypothesis and see how much validity there is to it. So there's some uncertainty with that. But we know for sure that if a hen hatches off a nest and she has to travel 1.5 miles to get to brood habitat, those poults aren't going to make it.
Yeah.
We know that. That's been well demonstrated with a lot of research already. So that's a solution that we know can have positive results if you can, burn your woods, do the right sort of habitat manipulations to get brood habitat out there. You're going to increase reproduction. It's going to happen. So, keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And decrease predation and at multiple life phases and everything else that goes along with that too. It's a whole cascade.
Yeah. Yeah. Improve habitat and you decrease predation and potentially maintain our predation.
Right.
or increase it.
Did you pay Adam to say that about habitat at the end?
No, I didn't. It is a common theme though, and that we've addressed it directly already on several episodes that biologists often default to this habitat role, but it's because it has this disproportionately huge effect, and it often is sort of like pulling the lever on all these other factors at the same time.
Right.
Something I think I'll repeat it because I think it's a really good line that came from Craig, and you may not have heard about it, Adam, but so I don't know if it'll be a surprise to you or not, but a substantial proportion of the nest in their study, and I think it was 10 or 12%, what was it, 12%?
12%.
They were losing to mowing.
Wow.
And I was thinking...
Yeah, I'm surprised it was that high. Wow, that's...
I think it's because it's in that very pastoral landscape in South Central Tennessee.
Yeah, it was. He described the landscape, and I forget what it was now. It was probably 50% open. Something like
35,
that.
I think.
Well, I'm talking about when you add all of them up. I think 35 was how much was pasture.
Maybe so.
But anyway, large portion of the landscape was very open, but mowing was prevalent, and I know that we all work with plenty of folks that they just need to get on the tractor and mow.
Recreational
Yeah.
mowers.
Yeah,
So that's an easy fix, right? Just
That's what I was saying.
Hold off the bush hogging until July, right?
That's what I was saying. If I told you that we could increase nesting success by 10 or 15% by saving you time and money, most people would be on that.
But then I don't get
the other thing that comes to my head on that too is that if those birds are nesting in pastures, then that's probably indicative of what the state of the woods are. The woods probably don't have a whole lot of success in a meeting.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we had him give the specific numbers on that, which aligned with the numbers from a South Carolina study that came out recently. It was the things that the turkeys were selecting the highest for nesting was about 7% of the landscape, if I recall.
Yeah.
3% early succession and 4%.
Yeah, the cover type that is driving selection the most in the models that they have evaluated is the least prevalent cover type on the landscape.
Yeah, I think it was 7% of the landscape was 40-something% of the nests.
Yeah. 7% of the landscape driving like 90-ish% of the model weight.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is pretty telling. And it was also part of that 7% is what everybody's looking at, like, oh, I need to go mow that.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I mean, if you still just have to drive around your tractor, believe it or not, you can drive it without the bush hog hooked up still.
Well,
with the PTO turned off.
Yeah, I've always said you can still drive the tractor. Let's just hook something different up to it.
There you go.
Something other than the mower, maybe a sprayer or
What about a chicken litter spreader?
Well, according to they didn't. He talked about the disease stuff as well, and they don't have very strong evidence for disease problems.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm being facetious, everybody.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take that little clip out and put it on social media. It'll go viral.
Okay. Maybe just a sprayer full of water, and you can just go water your plants.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, I'm sure we could think of something better.
Yeah, probably so.
Maybe a disc.
There you go.
So, well, Adam, I know that you're a busy guy and you're trying to keep tabs on at the state level, and this resource is very dear to us. So we appreciate you taking time to talk to us and tell us about the state of turkeys in your state. So
man, I appreciate the opportunity. We'll have to all get in the turkey woods together sometime.
Absolutely. It was really good to get that state agency perspective too. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we really wanted to get that that part of the story in. So thanks for that.
Good deal. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening in.
Wild Turkey Science is sponsored by Turkeys for Tomorrow and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. For more information, follow us on social media linked in the show notes below.